St. Ardrick's, Greystoke by Sea, possessed that particular combination of architectural confidence and meteorological resignation that marks the better class of English seaside parish church. The nave bore the salt-stained dignity of centuries spent in polite negotiation with the Channel winds, while the bell tower maintained its perpendicular aspirations despite a slight but persistent lean toward the graveyard, as if, Lord Peter Wimsey observed to his valet, it had developed a professional interest in its ultimate clientele. On this particular Thursday afternoon in late October, the bell was engaged in that most solemn of its duties, tolling the passing of one of Greystoke's more substantial citizens. The measured bronze voice spoke with the authority of centuries, marking each year of the departed's earthly sojourn with methodical precision. 52, murmured Wimsey, counting the final strokes with the detached interest of a connoisseur. Rather generous, if Mr. Algernon Rooke was indeed born in 1871, as the parish register suggests, though I suppose bell ringers, like obituary writers, tend toward charitable arithmetic. Quite so, my lord, replied Bunter, adjusting his umbrella against the persistent drizzle that seemed to be the afternoon's principal contribution to the solemnity of the occasion. His tone carried that perfect note of agreement that managed to be both deferential and entirely non-committal. The interior of St. Ardrick's had arranged itself with the practiced efficiency of a stage set between acts. Black-draped and solemn, the nave accommodated perhaps 24 mourners, a respectable showing for a man who had lived as quietly as Algernon Rooke was reputed to have done. The undertaker, one Mr. Mould, whose name, Wimsey reflected, suggested either remarkable parental prescience or a commendable dedication to professional appropriateness, supervised his assistants with the grave authority of a conductor preparing for a particularly melancholy symphony. At the chancel steps, the Reverend Mr. Thrip, a nervous, bird-like man whose surplice seemed to have been cut for someone considerably more substantial, clutched his prayer book with the desperate grip of a man who suspects his congregation might bolt at any moment. The black-draped coffin before him represented, according to the official account, all that remained of Algernon Rooke, late of Grey Chimneys, who had met his end 3 days previous in the treacherous waters off Souter's Cove. "Tragic business," whispered Mrs. Carruthers, a formidable matron whose hat suggested she had come prepared to wrestle with both grief and inclement weather, though one does wonder why he took that boat out in such weather. The Coast Guard warned everyone about the tides. Mr. Rooke was always one for his own counsel, replied her companion, a thin woman whose black gloves were already twisted into knots of nervous energy. Never one to take advice, even sensible advice. Pride, I always said. Pride comes before a fall, or in this case, a drowning. Wimsey, positioned strategically near a pillar that afforded both acoustic advantage and a clear view of the proceedings, noted these observations with the idle attention of a naturalist studying familiar specimens. The conversation was proceeding along precisely the lines one might expect. The deceased had been stubborn, the weather had been warned against, the sea had claimed another victim of human obstinacy. It was all very tidy, very reasonable, and, to Wimsey's experienced eye, just slightly too convenient in its completeness. The Reverend Mr. Thrip cleared his throat with the tentative authority of a man about to address subjects considerably more substantial than himself. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying the particular tremor that afflicts clergymen when confronted with mortality in its more dramatic forms, "we are gathered here today." The west door of St. Ardrick's, which had been maintaining its dignified closure with the steadfast reliability of English oak and medieval ironwork, chose this moment to surrender to a pressure it had apparently been resisting for some time. It swung open with a groan that spoke of centuries spent in reluctant service, admitting a gust of salt-laden air and, rather more dramatically, a figure that caused the Reverend Mr. Thrip's carefully prepared remarks to die in his throat like a candle in a sudden wind. The man in the doorway was unmistakably, indisputably, and rather inconveniently alive. He stood for a moment framed against the grey afternoon, water streaming from his clothes and hair, his face bearing the particular expression of a gentleman who has arrived at a social function to discover that the dress code has been rather more formal than anticipated. "I do beg your pardon," said Algernon Rook, in the tone of a man apologizing for a minor breach of etiquette rather than a fundamental violation of the natural order. "I appear to be somewhat behind schedule." The silence that followed possessed that peculiar quality found only in moments when reality has taken an unexpected and rather sharp turn to the left. Mrs. Carruthers sat down rather suddenly, her formidable hat tilting at an angle that suggested structural damage. The Reverend Mr. Thrip gripped his prayer book as though it might provide some theological guidance for dealing with resurrections that had not been scheduled in advance. Mr. Mould, being a professional, maintained his composure with admirable dignity, though his expression suggested he was already calculating the complexities of refunding a funeral that had been interrupted by its principal participant. Algernon Rook walked up the aisle with the measured pace of a man who wished to create as little additional disruption as possible under the circumstances. His clothes, Whimsy noted with professional interest, bore the unmistakable signs of recent and intimate acquaintance with sea-water, while his demeanor suggested a man who had recently experienced something considerably more dramatic than a pleasant afternoon's sailing. "Thrip," he said, nodding to the clergyman with the sort of polite acknowledgment one might offer to an acquaintance encountered unexpectedly at the railway station. "Terribly sorry about the confusion. I'm afraid there's been something of a misunderstanding regarding my availability for this particular ceremony." The Reverend Mr. Thrip opened and closed his mouth several times, producing no sound but achieving a remarkable resemblance to a landed fish. Finally, he managed, "Rook, that is to say, we thought." "Dead?" "Yes, I can see how you might have reached that conclusion. The evidence was, I admit, rather compelling. My boat certainly appears to have met with some sort of mishap, and I understand my walking stick was discovered in what the newspapers would undoubtedly describe as tragic circumstances. However, as you can observe, reports of my demise have been, to borrow Mr. Twain's excellent phrase, somewhat exaggerated." From the assembled mourners came the sort of collective murmur that accompanies any social situation in which the fundamental assumptions have been suddenly and dramatically revised. Whimsy, observing the scene with the detached interest of a connoisseur of human nature, noted the various expressions of confusion, relief, and, in at least 2 cases, what appeared to be distinct disappointment. "Algernon!" The cry came from a tall, elegant woman in the third pew, who rose with a sort of dramatic flourish that suggested either genuine emotion or considerable theatrical training. "My dear, what happened? Where have you been?" "Ah, Cassandra," Rook replied, his tone carrying a note of weary affection. "I'm afraid it's rather a long story, and not one particularly suited to our present ecclesiastical surroundings. Perhaps we might postpone the details until I've had an opportunity to change into something rather less maritime." He turned to address the congregation at large, his manner suggesting a man accustomed to dealing with social awkwardness through the application of impeccable manners. "Ladies and gentlemen, I can only apologize for this rather dramatic interruption of what I'm sure would have been a most moving service. I understand that considerable effort has been expended on my behalf, and I am both touched and somewhat embarrassed by the attention. However, as I appear to be in rather better health than anticipated, perhaps we might consider postponing the proceedings indefinitely." With that, he made his way back down the aisle, leaving behind him the sort of conversational chaos that occurs when a community's carefully constructed narrative encounters an inconvenient fact. Whimsy watched him go with the appreciation of a man who recognizes a performance when he sees one, though whether the performance lay in Rook's dramatic entrance or in the circumstances that had necessitated it remained for the moment an intriguing question. "Bunter," he murmured, as the congregation began the complex process of adjusting to their revised circumstances, "I believe we shall be staying in Greystoke rather longer than originally planned. Kindly make inquiries about accommodation, and perhaps, discreetly, about the tidal conditions 3 days past." "Very good, my lord." "And shall I also inquire about Mr. Rook's recent maritime adventures?" "Oh, I think we may safely leave that particular inquiry to Mr. Rook himself. Though I suspect," Wimsey added, watching the retreating figure disappear into the grey afternoon, "that his account of recent events may prove rather more interesting than the average sailor's tale of storm and survival." The bell of St. Audrick's had fallen silent, its work apparently concluded for the day, but Wimsey, with the instincts of a man who had learned to distrust convenient explanations, suspected that the real story was only beginning to unfold. "One cannot, fault Providence for a sense of the dramatic," observed Wimsey in the vestry, where the lingering scent of extinguished candles competed with a determined pot of geraniums. "Though one does feel the stage manager might have provided advance notice to the supporting cast." The Reverend Mr. Thrip, spectacles misted and hands fluttering among suddenly irrelevant burial papers, attempted to maintain clerical dignity. "I received every assurance, Lord Peter, that Mr. Rook had, departed this earthly realm. The Coast Guard discovered his walking stick, and Mr. Mould assured me that all arrangements were proper." "Mr. Mould furnished an empty coffin," Wimsey replied amiably. "Admirable preparation, but hardly constitutes proof of demise. When did you last converse with Mr. Rook before today's resurrection?" "Sunday after matins. We discussed the harvest appeal. Then, Monday evening, perhaps 6 o'clock, a telephone call regarding the church roof fund. He promised £50. Thrip frowned. "Most generous, considering his circumstances." "You are certain of the hour?" "As certain as one can be with clocks that perpetually disagree, but yes, approximately 6 inches. Mr. Mould appeared at the vestry door with professional gravity. "Begging pardon, gentlemen, the arrangements shall be held in abeyance. The coffin, properly weighted with clean bricks, as befits an unrecovered drowning, can be returned to storage." "Weighted," Thrip squeaked. "Standard practice for sea casualties, Reverend. Dignity requires substance, even in absence." Within the hour, Wimsey and Bunter had presented themselves at Grey Chimneys, where the household was attempting to process their master's inconvenient survival. Mrs. Pargeter, the housekeeper, a woman of compact authority who clearly regarded domestic chaos as a personal affront, received them in the drawing-room. "We've had our trials, my lord," she declared. "I warned Mr. Rook repeatedly about those treacherous waters, but gentlemen will have their own counsel." "On Monday afternoon," Wimsey inquired pleasantly, "what were Mr. Rook's arrangements?" "Left after tea, 4:30 precisely. Took bread and butter and seed cake. Said not to expect him for supper, as he fancied a sail." Treadgold, the butler, intervened with diplomatic precision. "If I may correct Mrs. Pargeter, the master requested cold supper at 8:30. I prepared a tray for the library." "His oilskins?" Wimsey asked. Mrs. Pargeter's brow furrowed. "Gone, I assumed, but checking after the Coast Guard's message, they hung on their peg, damp at the cuffs as though hastily replaced." I scolded Ellen for careless handling. Ellen, the parlour maid, bobbed defensively. "Never touched them, ma'am." Mr. Rook wore his brown overcoat. I watched from the scullery window. Had his stick and hat. Yet the hat, Treadgold observed, was discovered at the boathouse, while the stick appeared on the cliff path. Rather a geographical puzzle. Wimsey's eyebrows rose with interest. "And telephone communications that evening?" "The line suffered terribly," Mrs. Pargeter replied. Wind disrupts the connections. No calls received. Curious, Whimsy murmured. Mr. Thrip believes he spoke with your master at 6. Treadgold's expression grew arctic. Impossible, my lord. Mr. Rook departed before 5, and I tested the exchange at 6:45, completely dead. At the Coast Guard station, Mr. Preece, built like a seawall and twice as immovable, consulted tide charts with professional authority. Monday's tide turned at 12:28. By 5 o'clock, running out fierce as a mill race. No sensible man launches in such conditions. You observed activity. Light at 7, low beyond the pier head. Weather was fall. Could have been debris. Could have been someone hugging the breakwater. Found the skiff at dawn Tuesday. Bottom up, keel scored. Painter frayed, not cut. The walking stick's location? Cliff path above Black Rock. Wind had taken any footprints. Hat turned up in the boathouse bilge. Odd that, considering the current. Mrs. Hatch, presiding over the post office with monarchical authority, settled the telephone question definitively. Not so much as a whisper passed through my exchange Monday evening, she declared. Lines crossed somewhere on the hill, told them so repeatedly. Mr. Thrip came Tuesday morning, all aflutter about promised donations. I informed him that pious money travels swiftly, but not through damaged wires. Yet the vicar distinctly recalls a 6 o'clock conversation, Whimsy mused. Memory, Mrs. Hatch sniffed, decorates truth according to convenience. Returning to grey chimneys as afternoon shadows lengthened, Whimsy paused before the oilskins hanging innocently on their peg. The hall clock chimed with characteristic optimism, running 2 minutes fast. Bunter, he said quietly. We have a hat that travelled unaccompanied to the boathouse, a walking stick that took solitary exercise along the cliff, a telephone call that defied mechanical possibility, and oilskins that remained home while their owner supposedly battled the elements. What pattern emerges? That someone arranged a performance, my lord, Bunter replied, but neglected to rehearse the scenery properly. Precisely. The stage was set for tragedy, but the props tell a different story entirely. Most illuminating, and rather more interesting than the average maritime mishap. From upstairs came the sound of voices, Algernon Rook's measured tones mingling with his wife's lighter cadences. But the contradictions in the domestic testimony suggested that whatever drama had unfolded at Grey Chimneys, it had been considerably more complex than a simple sailing accident gone wrong. The investigation, Whimsy reflected, was only beginning to reveal its true nature. The raised voices upstairs subsided to a brittle tranquility before Whimsy had time to determine whether they represented reconciliation or mere exhaustion. He and Bunter were still contemplating the oilskins when the front door opened upon a gust of raw sea air and a young man whose impatience seemed to outrun even the November wind. Lionel Craddock possessed that unsteady elegance which suggests a tailor's continuous devotion and a banker's intermittent favor. His fair hair had the negligent perfection of expensive barbers. His expression, that of a man who has discovered that Providence keeps in different books. Though he had retained his father's name despite his expectations regarding his uncle's estate, his manner suggested someone accustomed to thinking of himself as the future master of Grey Chimneys. So he's alive, he said, not waiting for introduction. Well, that's a boomerang and no mistake. Where is he? In the morning room, mister. Craddock intoned Treadgold with a gravity usually reserved for bishops. Lord Peter Whimsy is with us. Lionel's bow was perfunctory. Honoured and all that. If you've come for the funeral, you're 24 hours late and £3,000 too soon. 3,000, murmured Whimsy. A neat, compact figure. One almost hears the clink of overdue interest. They found Algernon Rook in a wing-backed chair, the steam of hot whiskey rising about him like benevolent incense. Cassandra, arranged at a tactful angle between sympathy and theatrical grace, looked up with eyes large enough for the stage and a handkerchief as white as rectitude. Her beauty, though undeniable, carried the particular quality of someone who had learned to project emotion across footlights, a skill that served equally well in drawing rooms requiring careful navigation. "Lionel," she breathed, "you have heard." "Heard?" The bells told the village, and the village told me. "Uncle, I came on Tuesday to see Mordaunt about your will. He said he hadn't the executed copy. Now you've turned up, perhaps you'd be good enough to explain." Algernon surveyed him with a mildness that did not conceal steel. "My dear boy, had you waited another fortnight, you might have saved yourself the trouble of distressing my solicitor. As it is, I own I am surprised you were so quick off the mark." "Quick?" Lionel laughed unpleasantly. "When a man drowns, someone pays the debts he leaves behind. I happen to be the man left with them." The door admitted Inspector Craik, whose boots brought the outside in with uncompromising candor. "A most unusual case, mister. Rook alive, is he? That saves the coroner considerable paperwork. Still, there remains the matter of the boat and the circumstances. Many had reason to profit by your disappearance." Lionel swung round. "If you mean me, say so." "I mean you among others, sir," returned Craik, unruffled. "You called it Mr. Mordaunt's at 9 on Tuesday, inquired about probate procedures, and was seen later asking at the bank whether certain outstanding matters could be postponed." Cassandra interposed with practiced grace. "Inspector, this is intolerable. I was at the village hall Monday evening rehearsing for the Harvest Evensong. Mrs. Thrip conducted. I returned at 7:30 to find Algernon not yet home." "And earlier, madam?" asked Wimsey. 4 to 5? "In the house, then changing for rehearsal," she answered smoothly. "I walked to the hall with Ellen." "Ellen was laying the cold supper," murmured Treadgold with the faintest emphasis. Cassandra's lashes dropped, concealing either annoyance or calculation. Craik produced his notebook. "Fisherman Bowles reports seeing Mr. Craddock's motor car by the boathouse at 6 on Monday." "That's awkward, sir." "I drove down," admitted Lionel. "I thought, well, if the skiff had come in." "I was anxious." "Curious that your concern took you to the boathouse rather than to Grey Chimneys," Wimsey observed, "where news would have come sooner and sherry more certainly." They were interrupted by the entry of a young woman clutching a parcel as if it might explode. Her black serge dress and martyred expression spoke of unpaid invoices and injured pride. "Beg pardon, madam," she said to Cassandra. "Lydia Gray from the dressmaker. You said to bring the mourning bodice, but now there's no use for it, and I can't take back the material." Cassandra colored exquisitely. "It was a misunderstanding, Miss Gray. We all believed enough to order crepe at 9 Tuesday morning." Lydia's voice shook. "You gave me measurements before breakfast. Now you say no need. How am I to eat this week?" Wimsey turned a mildly curious eye upon Cassandra. 9 is commendably efficient, considering that hope runs late and certainty earlier." "I wish to be prepared," Cassandra replied stiffly. Algernon would have expected propriety. "And Mr. Lionel's car was down by the cove. Monday," Lydia continued, once launched. "My brother at the garage said so, asked him for petrol on tick at 5:30. Craik closed his notebook with satisfaction. "Facts that agree are always welcome. Tuesday morning, morning ordered. Monday evening, nephew at the boathouse, and telephone lines that couldn't carry the vicar's conversation. It's shaping very clear." "To what?" inquired Wimsey. "To melodrama, Inspector. I confess I prefer comedy of manners." Algernon's tired smile barely lifted. "I regret I cannot oblige you with simple villains, Lord Peter. Life has never proved so considerate." "Nor have I found it so," said Wimsey, glancing from Lionel's sullen frustration to Cassandra's wounded grace. "Still, melodrama serves admirably for keeping audiences awake." Outside, the wind pushed at the yews with petulant insistence, and the obvious suspects had been neatly arrayed. Whether they also supplied the truth remained to be seen. The drawing-room settled into that peculiar quiet, which follows the departure of authority, leaving behind the faint scent of official suspicion and the more persistent aroma of domestic unease. Wimsey, however, appeared entirely unaffected by the recent drama. He had discovered a small Sèvres shepherdess on the mantelpiece and was examining her with the absorbed attention of a connoisseur. "Charming piece," he murmured to Bunter, "though I fancy she's seen rather more excitement than her pastoral origins intended." He set the figure down with care and turned his attention to the room's more substantial features. "Mrs. Pargeter, these curtains. French damask, unless I'm much mistaken. Who attends to their arrangement?" "Ellen draws them at dusk, my lord," replied the housekeeper, appearing in the doorway with that supernatural promptness which marks the truly professional domestic. "Except Mondays, when I see to them myself if the girl is occupied elsewhere." "And last Monday?" "I drew them early, my lord." The sea fret comes sudden, and salt air ruins good fabric. Wimsey approached the French windows, noting how the heavy curtains would fall when drawn. The dark Axminster beneath showed faint, crystalline spots, 3 near the window, another elongated stain where the curtain hem would brush the skirting. "Bunter," he said quietly, "a sample of the carpet, if you please. And perhaps a thread from the curtain's edge." While Bunter performed these delicate extractions with surgical precision, Wimsey tested the French window's bolt. Well-oiled, silent, showing no resistance of neglect. "These were secured Monday evening?" "Bolted by me at 9, my lord," Mrs. Pargeter confirmed, though they were fastened earlier at dusk. "I make it my practice to check all fastenings before the household retires." "Admirable. And who last used the garden path?" "Mr. Rook himself, Sunday afternoon," Treadgold interjected. "He takes his constitutional after luncheon, weather permitting." Wimsey knelt, fingering the carpet's nap. "Tuesday's cleaning was thorough, I collect?" Mrs. Pargeter flushed slightly. "Wednesday is the proper day for carpets, but I had Ellen go over the library Tuesday morning. The vicar was expected, and standards must be maintained." "Indeed. Then these little constellations prove remarkably persistent." He touched one of the crystalline spots. "Salt clings to both memory and Axminster with equal tenacity." In the hall, the domestic chronometry presented its own puzzle. The bracket clock ventured 2 minutes of optimism. The kitchen timepiece lagged by 3. The dining room's handsome specimen had stopped entirely at 17 minutes past some forgotten hour. "Who winds the hall clock?" Wimsey inquired. "Treadgold, nightly," said Mrs. Pargeter. "And the kitchen?" "Ellen after supper," the girl replied hastily, as though tardiness were a moral failing. "Monday evening. I forgot until near 10, my lord." Miss Cassandra returned late from rehearsal, and there was confusion about the supper trays. Wimsey made no comment, but requested examination of the oilskins. The yellow fabric hung innocently on its appointed peg, but the cuffs, when turned, revealed a peculiar dampness. Not the sharp, stinging wet of sea-water, but something softer, more soapy to the touch. "Fresh water," Bunter murmured. "Laundry water, my lord, or rain wiped near a heated surface." The boathouse, Wimsey observed cheerfully, is notably deficient in both laundry facilities and warming stoves. Most curious that oilskins should acquire domestic dampness while their owner battles the channel's fury. At the cove, Mr. Priest consulted his tide tables with professional pride. "Monday's tide, my lord. Low water at 25 minutes past 6. Wind northeast, running fierce. Anything launched near the boathouse would have been pushed eastward past Black Rock, yet we found the skiff on the western side. Which suggests," Wimsey mused, "either that the boat began its adventure from an entirely different launching point, or that someone arranged for it to begin worrying at its moorings considerably earlier than the official departure time. The path above Black Rock, where the walking stick had been discovered, yielded only Bunter's careful collection of a tar smear against the chalk, from a boot sole, my lord, and the persistent scent of gorse and old coconut. Returning to grey chimneys, Whimsy paused in the library doorway. The acoustics of this room interest me considerably. With the curtains drawn and windows secured, would the church bell penetrate clearly? Barely audible, Algernon replied. One of the advantages of solid Georgian construction. Yet a telephone conversation might be conducted here without disturbing the household. Quite easily. The walls are remarkably thick. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. And the pantry. Key. Ellen mentioned that Miss Cassandra required it Monday evening. The girl twisted her apron. After 6, my lord, she said for jam. We'd run short in the parlor. Jam before evensong rehearsal, murmured Whimsy. Truly, the English devotion to proper nourishment transcends even spiritual obligations. He examined once more the salt-starred carpet, the curtains that had drunk sea-water yet hung innocent on their rods, the oilskins damp with fresh water while their owner supposedly drowned in salt. The pattern was there, faint as footprints on shingle, but discernible to eyes trained in the archaeology of deception. "Bunter, sir," he said finally, "we shall require a more detailed examination of Mr. Mordaunt's office hours, the precise timing of village rehearsals, and the curious case of household keys that travel without their appointed guardians. I begin to suspect that Monday evening's drama was considerably more complex than a simple maritime tragedy." "Very good, my lord. The evidence suggests a performance rather than an accident." "Precisely. Though whether the performance was tragedy or farce remains to be determined. The systematic demolition of Monday evening's official chronology began at dawn, when Whimsy discovered that the village's temporal infrastructure possessed all the reliability of a music hall comedian's pocket watch. Armed with Bunter's methodical notes and a growing appreciation for the creative possibilities of selective memory, he embarked upon what he privately termed the archaeology of deception. The Reverend Mr. Thrip received them in his study with the haunted expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions about reality had suffered recent and violent revision. "You are quite certain," Whimsy began, examining the vicar's ancient telephone with professional interest, "that you conversed with Mr. Rook at 6 o'clock Monday evening?" "Absolutely certain, Lord Peter. We discussed the roof fund. He promised £50. His voice was perfectly clear, though the connection seemed rather hollow. "Hollow?" Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. "And yet Mrs. Hatch maintains that the main exchange was completely inoperative from 5:30 until Tuesday morning." Bunter produced a small diagram. "The local telephone engineer, my lord, confirms an interesting anomaly. Grey chimneys and the rectory share an emergency connection, a direct line installed during the war for air raid communications. It bypasses the main exchange entirely." "Ah," said Whimsy, "so Mr. Rook could indeed telephone you directly, despite the general outage, which rather suggests he was comfortably ensconced in his library at 6, rather than battling the elements in a small boat." At the railway station, the station master's records proved devastatingly precise. Tuesday's 9:32 from London brought 3 passengers, Lord Peter. Young Craddock was not among them. I'd stake my pension on it. Yet he appeared at Mr. Mordaunt's office Tuesday morning, claiming to have arrived by that very train. Then he's a magician or a liar, begging your lordship's pardon. Whimsy consulted his pocket watch against the station clock. And Monday's last train, 4:27, punctual as always, brought only a commercial gentleman and a lady in deep mourning who took the carrier's cart toward Littlehaven. "A lady in mourning," Whimsy murmured. "Rather premature, considering the official tragedy had not yet occurred." The collapse of Cassandra's alibi proved even more spectacular. Mrs. Thrip, consulted over tea and seed cake, delivered the fatal blow with Christian charity. The Harvest Evensong rehearsal, Lord Peter. Oh, that was postponed from Monday to Tuesday. The church heating failed, and half the choir had taken cold. I spent Monday evening at home with improving literature. Then Mrs. Rook's presence at rehearsal on Monday. Quite impossible, I'm afraid, though she did attend Tuesday's rescheduled session most punctually. The village's chronometric chaos provided its own revelations. The church clock ran 3 minutes fast. The post office timepiece lagged by 5. The rectory study clock had lost 11 minutes since Sunday's winding, yet each witness swore by their particular timekeeper's accuracy. "Ellen," Whimsy inquired back at Grey Chimneys, "when you heard the church bell Monday evening, was it the usual hourly chime?" "Muddled like, my lord." "Not the proper sequence, just a sort of clanging near the hour." "That's when Miss Cassandra called for the pantry key." The sexton, when pressed, admitted to confusion. "I was certain I'd checked the mechanism Monday evening, Lord Peter. But my timesheet shows Tuesday. Memory plays tricks when routine breaks." Treadgold's testimony added another impossible element. "I heard the library telephone ring twice at approximately 7:30 Monday, my lord. Yet when I investigated, the line was completely dead." "The emergency connection," Bunter explained quietly. "Someone testing the direct line's operation." The tidal evidence proved most damning of all. Mr. Priest's charts showed Monday's ebb running fiercely eastward from 6 o'clock onward. Anything launched from the boathouse would drift past Black Rock towards Seabridge, he confirmed. Yet we found the skiff to the west, against the current's natural flow. "Which suggests," said Whimsy, "either that the boat was launched from an entirely different location, or that someone deliberately guided it westward for discovery." Lionel's presence at the boathouse during these crucial hours now assumed sinister significance. The garage proprietor confirmed his petrol purchase at 5:30, paid with a £10 note. Remarkable generosity from a man reportedly facing financial embarrassment. By afternoon, the accumulated contradictions had transformed Monday evening from a tragic accident into an elaborate theatrical performance. The salt crystals on the drawing-room carpet, the fresh-water dampness of unused oilskins, the hat's migration to the boathouse. Each detail now spoke of careful staging rather than natural disaster. "Bunter," Whimsy said finally, standing once more in the library where the phantom telephone calls had been placed and emergency lines tested, "we have established that our principals were not where they claimed, doing what they professed at the times they specified. The question becomes, what were they actually accomplishing during those carefully obscured hours?" "The evidence suggests coordination, my lord. Multiple parties working toward a common deception." "Precisely. And deceptions of such complexity require not merely motive and opportunity, but also a directing intelligence capable of choreographing the entire performance. Someone who understood the village's temporal weaknesses and exploited them with considerable skill. The chronology had been tested and found wanting, not through incompetence, but through deliberate manipulation. Monday evening's tragedy was revealed as Monday evening's fraud, orchestrated by parties whose true motives remained tantalizingly obscure. The systematic demolition of Monday evening's official chronology had revealed the mechanics of deception, but not its motive. Whimsy, possessed of that particular curiosity which regards locked drawers as personal invitations, had noted during his examination of the library a mahogany escritoire whose brass fittings bore the telltale scratches of frequent but furtive use. "Mr. Rook," he observed pleasantly, finding his host attempting to restore normalcy with the morning's Times. "I confess myself intrigued by your reading preferences. The antiquarian notices command your particular attention, I perceive." Algernon lowered the newspaper with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned to weigh each word before release. "I have developed certain scholarly interests in recent years, Lord Peter. The isolation of seaside life encourages intellectual pursuits." "Indeed. And your correspondence with various London dealers, would that fall under scholarly pursuit or commercial enterprise?" The newspaper rustled as Rook's hands tightened imperceptibly. Bunter, meanwhile, had discovered that the escritoire's lock possessed all the resistance of a confession under pressure. Within lay a correspondence that painted Algernon Rook in colors considerably more vivid than his public persona suggested. The letters spoke in the coded language of dealers who operate in markets where provenance matters less than profit. Blackwood and Associates of Jermyn Street wrote with the careful circumlocution of professionals who understood the value of plausible deniability. References to the Venetian items, monastery acquisitions, and Syrian collections suggested enterprises that would not bear close scrutiny from customs authorities or ecclesiastical investigators. "Most illuminating," Whimsy murmured, examining a letter dated 3 weeks previous. "Mr. Blackwood appears concerned about certain irregularities in documentation. He mentions ecclesiastical authorities making inquiries and suggests that temporary absence from usual haunts might prove prudent." A second cache, discovered behind a false back cunningly fitted to the drawer, revealed bank statements showing deposits far exceeding the modest income of a retired gentleman. Shipping receipts documented packages arriving from Constantinople, Naples, and Alexandria, while insurance valuations described objects whose legitimate ownership would require considerable explanation. "The Coptic manuscript fragments," Whimsy read aloud. "Provenance uncertain, but authenticity confirmed. Estimated value £2,000. He looked up with mild inquiry. "Rather specialized collecting for a gentleman of quiet tastes." But it was among the local correspondence that the most damning evidence emerged. Letters signed with the wandering identity of Eslatham, Eslathiel, and finally Salathiel spoke with technical precision about clapper composition, bloomed iron of sympathetic age, and rubbings for punch positions. One enclosed a small tracing on transparent paper, an oval device with a griffin regardant whose measurements corresponded less with modest domestic silver than with the proportions of ecclesiastical plate. Salathiel appears to be a gentleman of Old Testament nomenclature and New Testament flexibility regarding the 8th commandment, Whimsy observed. His expertise extends to the artificial aging of metals, a useful skill when one's inventory requires historical authentication. Cassandra entered at this moment, her morning toilette achieving that particular perfection which suggests considerable time spent before mirrors and considerable anxiety about what they might reveal. "Algernon, darling," she said, her voice carrying only the faintest tremor. "Inspector Craik telephoned. He wishes to speak with you again this afternoon." The final revelation came in a letter bearing Tuesday's postmark, delivered with exquisite irony, while its recipient was presumed drowned. The message was brief but devastating. "Authorities investigating Syrian monastery thefts. Your name mentioned. Suggest immediate departure. Funds transferred to Marseille account as arranged. Destroy all correspondence." "It appears," Whimsy observed, "that your scholarly interests had attracted unwelcome official attention. Someone with access to international telegraph services had warned you that investigation was imminent." Rook's composure finally cracked like poorly fired ceramic. "You don't understand the complexities involved. These artifacts were already stolen. I merely prevented their destruction by ignorant dealers. I provided them with proper scholarly appreciation. And proper commercial exploitation," Whimsy added, gently. "The insurance valuations suggest your appreciation took decidedly practical forms." A visit to Mr. Mordaunt, Rook's solicitor, confirmed the emerging picture. Mordaunt, whose professional rectitude was as unyielding as his starched collar, confessed to unease regarding some of Rook's recent instructions. Mr. Rook had been particularly anxious in recent months, he revealed, demanding large sums of cash and making veiled references to a deal gone sour and certain parties making unreasonable demands. He had even attempted to raise a substantial loan against Great Chimneys, entirely out of character for a man of his independent means. Bunter's investigation of the local post office revealed additional correspondence with a firm of Geneva solicitors regarding holding companies and urgent liquidity requirements for offshore assets. The postmaster, Mrs. Hatch, noted with professional disapproval that Mr. Rook had recently begun collecting his own mail rather than allowing normal delivery. Most irregular for a gentleman of his standing. The double life of Algernon Rook, respectable village gentleman and international antiquities smuggler, lay revealed in all its contradictory complexity. The staged drowning now appeared not as domestic melodrama, but as a desperate flight from professional entanglement. The missing cash, the frantic attempts to raise funds, the coded correspondence, all pointed to a man in deep trouble, seeking to vanish and reappear with a clean slate. "So," Whimsy murmured, surveying the library where Algernon had conducted his clandestine transactions. Our man was not merely playing dead for dramatic effect. He was playing dead to escape a very real and rather dangerous form of life. The question now becomes, who else knew of the other Algernon? And to what extent were they complicit in his elaborate vanishing act? The investigation had uncovered not merely a staged accident, but the desperate expedient of a man whose secret career had finally caught up with him. The revelation of Algernon Rook's clandestine career had provided motive for his disappearance, but Whimsy, possessed of that particular suspicion which regards solved puzzles as incomplete until every piece fits perfectly, found himself drawn back to the domestic trifles that had seemed merely eccentric during his initial investigation. "Mrs. Pargeter," he said, discovering the housekeeper engaged in her morning inventory with the grim determination of a general reviewing troops before battle. "You mentioned that certain household items had gone astray during recent events. Might we discuss the particulars?" "Indeed, my lord," she replied, consulting her ledger with professional gravity. "The Georgian salver, the small one with the griffon regardant crest, has been missing since Tuesday morning. I assumed it had been moved for the funeral arrangements, but Mr. Mould assures me he required no additional plate." Whimsy's eyebrows rose with interest. The griffon regardant, precisely the device detailed in the mysterious Salathiel correspondence discovered among Rook's papers. "When did you last observe this piece in its proper location?" "Monday afternoon, my lord, when I dusted the library. It occupied its usual position on the side table near the escritoire. By Tuesday morning's inspection, it had vanished entirely." Treadgold, summoned by the gravity of missing silver, confirmed the loss with professional distress. "A piece of considerable value, Lord Peter, hall-marked 1787, bearing the authentic Rook arms. Mrs. Rook's grandfather commissioned it from Hester Bateman herself." "Authentic hallmarks?" Whimsy murmured thoughtfully. "How useful such authenticity becomes when one's business involves items of more questionable provenance." The butler's composure flickered slightly. "I beg your pardon, my lord?" "Nothing, Treadgold. Merely observing that genuine articles possess value beyond their immediate function." Whimsy turned his attention to the French windows, examining once again the brass fittings that had occupied his interest during previous visits. "Mrs. Pargeter, you are absolutely certain these windows were properly secured Monday evening?" "Quite certain, my lord. I personally tested each bolt before retiring. It is my invariable practice." She paused, frowning slightly. "Though I did notice something curious. The small window in the scullery, which opens onto the herb garden, was not properly latched. Most unusual, as Ellen is meticulous about such matters." Ellen, summoned to account for this domestic irregularity, twisted her apron with nervous energy. "I'm certain I secured it proper, ma'am. But when I came down Tuesday morning, it was sitting loose on its catch. Not open, mind you, but not tight neither." Whimsy examined the scullery window with renewed interest, small, inconspicuous, opening directly on to the kitchen garden where someone might pass unobserved in the evening's gathering darkness. "Large enough," he observed to Bunter, "for the passage of moderately sized objects, though hardly suitable for human transit." Returning to the library, Whimsy knelt once more beside the salt-crystallized carpet, touching the stiff residue that Ellen had attempted to clean. "Bunter, these deposits suggest prolonged contact with seawater, not the brief dampness one might expect from an opened window during a sea fret." "Indeed, my lord. The concentration suggests something thoroughly soaked with brine was placed here for some time. Or someone," Whimsy added quietly, "wearing garments saturated with channel water stood here while conducting business that required privacy." He examined the escritoire where Rook's correspondence had been discovered, noting fresh scratches around the lock and a faint residue of metal filings on the leather writing surface. "The tools of Salathiel's trade," he murmured. "One might transfer authentic hallmarks from a genuine Georgian piece to items requiring more respectable provenance." Mrs. Pargeter, following his reasoning with growing alarm, clutched her ledger more tightly. "Surely you don't suggest that Mr. Rook would damage family silver for such purposes?" "I suggest," Whimsy replied gently, "that a man facing international investigation for antiquities smuggling might sacrifice a salver to preserve his liberty. The authentic Rook arms, carefully transferred to stolen ecclesiastical pieces, would provide them with impeccable English provenance." The implications hung in the air like morning mist. The missing salver, the disturbed scullery window, the salt deposits on the library carpet. Each detail now spoke not of accident or oversight, but of careful preparation for flight. Someone had been working in the library Monday evening, using authentic family silver to complete final forgeries before departure. "The chronology becomes clearer," Whimsy continued, addressing the assembled household staff. "Mr. Rook required one final evening to complete essential preparations, but the work demanded absolute secrecy, hence the elaborate performance with oilskins and departure times, creating the illusion of absence while actually remaining to finish crucial business." Treadgold's professional composure finally cracked. But the telephone call to the vicar, Mr. Rook spoke with him at 6 o'clock. "Via the emergency line," Whimsy confirmed. "While officially departed, actually present and working frantically to complete his preparations for genuine disappearance. The missing salver was sacrificed to provide authentic marks for his final batch of forgeries." The domestic staff exchanged glances, heavy with implication. Their master's staged drowning had been merely the public performance. The real drama had unfolded within these walls, where family silver became the instrument of international deception. But one question remained tantalizingly unanswered. If Rook had successfully completed his preparations Monday night, why had circumstances forced his inconvenient resurrection? The evening mist crept up from Suitor's Cove as Whimsy arranged his final performance, the bell tower of St. Odric's leaning with its customary professional interest toward the proceedings. He had assembled his cast with the methodical precision of a theatrical director. Inspector Craik, solid and expectant. Cassandra, pale beneath an advantageous veil. Lionel, nervous energy barely contained. Algernon Rook, oddly diminished in his own doorway. And the domestic staff, arranged as witnesses to their master's resurrection. "We shall begin," announced Whimsy cheerfully, "with a demonstration of Monday evening's carefully choreographed tragedy. Bunter, if you would be so good as to assist with our theatrical properties." From the boathouse, Bunter produced a canvas sack, a coil of rope, and a quantity of coarse salt dampened into yielding consistency. "Our dramatis personae," Whimsy explained, arranging the salt-filled sack and draping it with an overcoat. The supposed victim, complete with the maritime associations necessary for a convincing drowning. They processed to grey chimneys, where the drawing-room carpet still bore its constellation of salt crystals, despite Ellen's diligent scrubbing. Whimsy placed the brine-soaked sack precisely upon the stained area. Observe how salt marks the Axminster when given sufficient time and moisture. Our supposed drowned man must exist long enough to establish his presence in this room while officially battling the Channel's fury. He moved to the French windows, testing their silent operation. Mrs. Pargeter secured these at 9 o'clock, but the scullery window, small, inconspicuous, opening onto the kitchen garden, was found ajar Tuesday morning. Through such an aperture, one might pass moderately sized objects without disturbing the household's evening routine. The demonstration continued to the cove, where Whimsy illustrated how the skiff had been launched against the prevailing tide, guided westward for strategic discovery. The walking stick's placement on the cliff path, the hat's migration to the boathouse, each element revealed the careful staging of maritime disaster. The performance, Whimsy observed, was admirable in its attention to detail. However, like many theatrical productions, it concealed a rather different drama occurring simultaneously behind the scenes. Returning to the library, he produced a telegram bearing Tuesday's postmark. Salathiel arrested Dover attempting board Calais packet, he read aloud. Syrian monastery identifies stolen chalice. Rook warrant issued, advise immediate detention. This message, delivered while our host was presumed drowned, explains the inconvenient necessity of resurrection. Algernon shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The authorities moved faster than anticipated. Remaining dead offered no protection once my associate was captured with incriminating evidence. Precisely, Whimsy agreed. But this telegram raises a fascinating question. If you successfully staged your drowning Monday evening and remained hidden until Thursday, why risk exposure by appearing at your own funeral? The answer, I submit, lies not in what was staged, but in what was genuine. He approached the escritoire where the forged correspondence had been discovered. The salt deposits on this carpet, the emergency telephone call at 6 o'clock, the missing Georgian salver, all confirm that someone was indeed present in this room Monday evening, completing final preparations for flight. However, the dampness on those oilskins tells a different story entirely. Bunter stepped forward with a small vial. Fresh water, my lord, laundry water, or perhaps water from the hand basin in the corner, not the salt spray of channel storms. Which suggests, Whimsy continued, that while Mr. Rook was working at his desk, someone else was engaged in rather more aquatic activities. The real tragedy of Monday evening was not a drowning at sea, but a drowning much closer to home. The library fell silent except for the whisper of sea wind through the partially opened French windows. Whimsy's voice grew colder, more precise. The staged drowning was indeed elaborate theatre, but it served to conceal a genuine murder. Someone entered this room while Mr. Rook completed his forgeries. Someone who knew of his criminal activities and saw opportunity in his planned disappearance. He gestured toward the hand basin in the corner. The struggle was brief but decisive. The real Algernon Rook was drowned here, in this very room, his head held beneath the water by someone he trusted enough to admit during his vulnerable final preparations. Cassandra's gloved hands trembled against the chair back. The theatrical composure that had served her so well was beginning to crack under the weight of Whimsy's methodical reconstruction. The murderer then faced a delicate problem: how to dispose of the body while maintaining the fiction of accidental drowning. The church tower provided an ideal temporary solution, a place where sound is muffled and visitors are rare. The scuffed bricks Bunter discovered, the disturbed dust patterns, all evidence of recent clandestine activity. He moved toward the French windows, noting how the heavy curtains would conceal activity within. Tuesday before dawn, with suitable transport and considerable nerve, the body was moved from its sacred hiding place to unholy water. But something went wrong. Perhaps the tide delayed its offices. Perhaps official scrutiny proved more thorough than anticipated. Wimsey's gaze settled on the man claiming to be Algernon Rook, which necessitated the most audacious deception of all, the resurrection of the victim by his own murderer. The man who appeared at Thursday's funeral was not the miraculously saved Algernon Rook, but someone who had studied his habits, his mannerisms, his correspondence sufficiently to assume his identity. The impostor's composure finally shattered. "You cannot prove such theatrical nonsense." "Can I not?" Wimsey's smile held no warmth. The real Algernon Rook possessed certain distinctive characteristics: a slight tremor in his right hand when agitated, a habit of humming Purcell when concentrating, and most tellingly, a birthmark precisely here on his left wrist. He indicated his own wrist with surgical precision. The man instinctively pulled back his sleeve, revealing unmarked skin. The gesture was as damning as any confession. The salt deposits on evening clothes, carefully cleaned but not entirely removed. The 10-pound note bearing traces of distinctive red sealing wax. The remarkable prescience in ordering mourning attire before death was confirmed. Wimsey's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. Most damning of all, the emergency telephone call to Mr. Thrip was made not by the real Algernon Rook, but by his murderer, testing both the line's operation and his own ability to deceive through vocal mimicry. The drawing room held its breath as the full scope of the deception became clear. The staged drowning had been merely the opening act. The real drama lay in murder, impersonation, and the desperate gamble of appearing as one's own victim. Inspector Craik stepped forward, his hand moving toward his handcuffs. The theatrical reveal was complete, but the final curtain had yet to fall. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, every person in the drawing room suspended between disbelief and the inexorable weight of evidence. The man who had claimed resurrection stood frozen, his unmarked wrist still exposed, while Inspector Craik's hand hovered over his handcuffs with the deliberation of justice itself. "The birthmark," Wimsey continued with quiet precision, "merely confirms what the accumulated evidence has already established beyond reasonable doubt. We are not confronting a miraculous return from the dead, but rather a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving murder, impersonation, and the calculated exploitation of a dead man's criminal enterprises." He turned his attention to Cassandra, whose theatrical composure was beginning to crack like poorly fired porcelain. "The true architect of this elaborate deception stands before us, not the nervous young man who has played his part with admirable dedication, but the woman who conceived, directed, and profited from the entire performance." Wimsey moved to the escritoire, his fingers tracing the scratched leather surface where authentic hallmarks had been transferred from family silver to stolen antiquities. "Let us reconstruct Monday evening's actual events, shall we?" The real Algernon Rook was indeed present in this library, completing his final preparations for disappearance. The salt deposits on this carpet, the missing Georgian salver, the emergency telephone equipment, all confirm his presence and his desperate final work. But he was not alone. Someone else was present, someone who possessed intimate knowledge of his criminal activities, his planned escape, and, most crucially, his vulnerability during those final, frantic hours of preparation. The impostor, clearly Lionel Craddock, as his nervous energy and financial desperation now made evident, began to tremble visibly. Wimsey's voice grew colder as he continued the inexorable reconstruction. "The emergency telephone call to Mr. Thrip at 6 o'clock was not made by Algernon Rook. It was made by Mrs. Cassandra Rook, testing both the direct line's operation and her own ability to deceive through vocal mimicry. The hollow quality Mr. Thrip noted was not a mechanical fault, but the subtle difference between the original voice and its careful imitation. While the village believed her attending a choir rehearsal that had been postponed, Mrs. Rook was here, observing her husband's final preparations, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The murder itself was accomplished with domestic efficiency, a struggle at the washstand in the corner, where Algernon's head was held beneath the water until life departed. Hence the fresh-water dampness on those oilskins which never saw Channel spray. Cassandra's face had assumed the waxy pallor of exposed guilt, but she maintained her silence with the stubborn determination of a professional performer who refuses to break character even as the curtain falls. The immediate challenge, Whimsy continued, was disposal of the body while maintaining the fiction of accidental drowning. The scullery window, left strategically ajar, provided egress for the corpse, which was then concealed in St. Odric's bell tower, a location offering both sanctity and seclusion. The scuffed bricks, the disturbed dust patterns, all confirmed this temporary arrangement. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rook completed her husband's final batch of forgeries, using the authentic Georgian salver to transfer legitimate hallmarks onto stolen ecclesiastical pieces. The missing family silver was sacrificed to provide unimpeachable English provenance for items that would otherwise bear the inconvenient stigma of foreign theft. Inspector Craik found his voice at last. And the resurrection? Why risk such an elaborate impersonation? Because Tuesday's telegram changed everything, Whimsy replied. The arrest of Salathiel in Dover, the issuance of warrants, the sudden acceleration of official investigation, all made continued death impossible. A vanished Algernon Rook might escape justice, but his frozen assets would remain beyond reach. A living Algernon, however, could sign checks, pacify creditors, and maintain access to carefully hidden wealth. He gestured toward the trembling impostor. Enter Mr. Lionel Craddock, whose family resemblance and financial desperation made him an ideal candidate for resurrection. With careful coaching, in voice, mannerisms, and intimate details gleaned from correspondence, he could convincingly portray his late uncle, at least long enough to complete essential financial arrangements. The £10 note bearing traces of distinctive red sealing wax, the premature ordering of mourning attire, the remarkable prescience regarding funeral arrangements, all evidence of a conspiracy that required advanced planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's affairs. Whimsy's final words fell like a judge's gavel. Mrs. Rook murdered her husband for the oldest of motives: money, control, and the preservation of social position. She then recruited his nephew to perpetuate the deception, exploiting family loyalty and financial desperation to secure her own escape from the consequences of her crime. Cassandra's theatrical mask finally shattered completely. "He was going to abandon me," she whispered, her voice stripped of its practiced modulation. "Leave me to face the scandal alone while he disappeared with his ill-gotten fortune. I merely accelerated his departure." "And assumed control of his assets," Whimsy observed quietly. "Murder, madam, however elegantly staged, remains murder." Inspector Craik stepped forward with renewed authority. "Mrs. Cassandra Rook, Mr. Lionel Craddock, I arrest you both for the murder of Algernon Rook and conspiracy to defraud. The theatrical performances are concluded." The quiet comeuppance had arrived with the inexorable precision of justice itself. The conspiracy of resurrection had been exposed as a conspiracy of murder, and the final curtain was about to fall on the most elaborate performance Greystoke-by-Sea had ever witnessed. The handcuffs clicked with metallic finality, but Cassandra's composure shattered like poorly tempered glass. Inspector Craik, recognizing the proximity of complete confession, gestured toward St. Odric's looming bell tower. "Perhaps," he suggested with professional delicacy, "the lady might prefer to conclude this matter where it began." They walked in solemn procession through the churchyard, where ancient yews leaned inward like gossips sharing secrets. The bell tower's door, seldom opened save for maintenance, groaned on hinges that had witnessed centuries of human folly. Within, the narrow stone steps spiraled upward into darkness, while dust motes danced in Bunter's lantern light like guilty thoughts made visible. "We need not ascend," Whimsy observed quietly. "Truth descends of its own weight when properly encouraged." Cassandra paused at the threshold, her theatrical training finally abandoning her entirely. The carefully modulated voice that had deceived a village cracked like autumn leaves. 20 years, she whispered, the words echoing against stone walls that had absorbed centuries of confession. 20 years of marriage to a man who collected stolen treasures with more passion than he ever showed his wife. The admission poured forth with the unstoppable force of water through a broken dam. She described the gradual revelation of Algernon's criminal enterprises, her unwitting complicity in maintaining his respectable facade, the growing realization that she had become merely another acquisition in his collection, valuable for display, useful for authentication, but ultimately disposable. Monday evening, I watched him prepare his final escape with the methodical precision he applied to everything, she continued, her eyes fixed on the stone steps where she had dragged her husband's corpse. No consideration for my position, no provision for my survival once his crimes were exposed. He spoke of Marseille, of starting fresh, but I knew what that meant. Abandonment, disgrace, poverty while he disappeared with our accumulated wealth. The murder itself had been born of desperate calculation rather than passionate fury. He was humming that dreadful Purcell tune he always did when pleased with his cleverness, she said, her voice assuming the flat cadence of someone reliving a nightmare, washing his hands at the basin, oblivious to everything except his precious forgeries. I saw my chance, perhaps my only chance. The struggle had been brief but decisive. 20 years of suppressed resentment had given her strength she never knew she possessed. He made barely a sound, she admitted with something approaching wonder. Then he was still, and I was free, or so I thought. Lionel, trembling against the tower's curved wall, found his voice at last. She told me Uncle had faked his death, that he was hiding from dangerous associates, he said miserably. I was desperate, my debts, my failed investments. When she showed me his correspondence, proved he intended to abandon us both. It seemed like justice rather than deception. Justice? Cassandra laughed bitterly. I merely claimed what 20 years of complicity had earned me. His wealth, his collections, his carefully hoarded profits from theft. Why should he escape with everything while I faced scandal and ruin? The practical arrangements had required careful orchestration. The emergency telephone call to establish his presence, the body's temporary concealment in the tower's sacred darkness, the strategic placement of evidence to suggest drowning. The bell tower was inspiration born of necessity, she explained. Sacred ground seemed appropriate for someone who had spent his life desecrating it. But Tuesday's telegram had changed everything. The arrest of Algernon's associate, the acceleration of official investigation, the sudden impossibility of remaining safely dead. We needed time to transfer funds, to dispose of evidence, to establish new identities. Lionel's resemblance was remarkable. With proper coaching, he could maintain the deception long enough for us to escape. The final irony was not lost on any of them. The elaborate resurrection meant to provide escape had instead ensured capture. The theatrical performance that should have secured freedom had delivered only exposure and disgrace. Inspector Craik consulted his pocket watch with professional satisfaction. The London train departs in 2 hours. Sufficient time to collect your effects for a rather different journey than you had planned. As the conspirators were led away, Cassandra turned once toward the tower stairs where her husband's body had briefly rested. He collected beautiful things, she said quietly, but never understood their true cost. The ancient stones of St. Audric's absorbed this final confession as they had absorbed centuries of human weakness, while the bell above remained mercifully silent in its witness to the wages of deception. The police motor car disappeared into the November mist with its cargo of defeated conspirators, leaving behind only the whisper of autumn wind through grey chimneys' empty rooms. Whimsy stood in the churchyard of St. Audric's, contemplating the leaning tower with the detached appreciation of a connoisseur who has witnessed a particularly complex performance reach its inevitable conclusion. "A most instructive case, Bunter," he observed, adjusting his monocle against the gathering dusk. "One might compose an entire treatise on the theological implications of resurrection as criminal enterprise, though I suspect the Reverend Mr. Thrip will require considerable time to reconcile his doctrine with recent events." "Indeed, my lord," Bunter replied, securing the last of their evidential materials with characteristic precision. "The irony appears particularly acute, attempting to escape justice through the assumption of one's own victim's identity." The Reverend Mr. Thrip approached with the tentative air of a man whose fundamental assumptions about mortality had suffered recent and violent revision. "Lord Peter," he began hesitantly, "I confess myself entirely bewildered. Was any of it genuine?" "The telephone call was genuine enough, Thrip," Whimsy replied with characteristic amusement, "though not conducted by the party you supposed. As for the funeral, it achieved a certain theatrical authenticity despite the absence of its principal participant. The resurrection proved rather more literal than anyone anticipated, though hardly in the sense our Sunday school lessons suggest." They walked slowly toward the village, where lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows like scattered stars. The domestic tranquility of Greystoke-by-Sea had been restored, though Whimsy suspected it would be some time before the inhabitants ceased glancing nervously toward grey chimneys. "The real tragedy," he continued thoughtfully, "lies not in the murder itself, but in the gradual corruption of human relationships by greed and deception. Algernon Rook collected beautiful objects stolen from their proper places. His wife collected grievances with equal dedication. Both hoards eventually demanded payment in full. At the railway station, Mr. Mould appeared with professional gravity. "Should you require our services in future, Lord Peter, we maintain the highest standards of discretion." "I trust," Whimsy replied with a slight smile, "that any future clients will prove more cooperative regarding their own mortality. Empty coffins, while dramatically effective, present certain logistical challenges." Mrs. Pargeter, encountered near the station, clutched a small parcel with determined dignity. "The household silver, my lord. What remains of it? I shall have the Georgian salver copied. It shall not be said the family plate wants completing." "Imitation is safer when confined to silver," Whimsy observed gently. "Once begun on husbands, it grows decidedly unhygienic." As the London Express arrived with metropolitan punctuality, Whimsy settled into his compartment with the satisfied air of a man who has witnessed justice, accomplished through methodical reasoning. The village disappeared into evening mist, its secrets exposed and its temporary resurrection concluded. "Bunter," he said finally, opening his evening paper with characteristic precision, "remind me to avoid seaside parishes during the autumn months. The combination of salt air and human nature proves remarkably corrosive to both silver and moral fiber." "Very good, my lord. And the theological implications of staged drownings?" "Hardly necessary," Whimsy replied, his attention turning to the crossword puzzle. "I suspect good Thrip will be contemplating those implications for considerable time, though I do hope he remembers to correct his Latin quotations. For whom the bell tolls requires no grammatical improvement, whatever his homiletical enthusiasm suggests." He lit a cigarette and watched the countryside slide past in the gathering darkness. "The amateur of epitaphs, Bunter, always errs by writing for the living. The dead require no commentary. They keep their own counsel admirably. De mortuis nil nisi bonum, though in this case one might prefer de viventibus nil nisi verum." Truth for the living proves a sterner diet, but considerably more nourishing. The train carried them toward London through the darkness, leaving behind a village that had learned through bitter experience that resurrection, however cleverly staged, inevitably leads to consequences far more permanent than death itself.